Ненавижу, чувствую теперь я, куда себя мечтать облёк, как мало вас ко мне доверия, как чужд я вам и как далек. Ах, я терзаюсь этой далью, со страждом я всей душой, печалью с вашей я печалью, и плачу вашею слезой. Ах, я терзаюсь этой далью, состражду вам я всей душой. Я вас люблю, люблю безмерно, без вас не мыслю дня прожить. Я подвиг силы беспримерной готов сейчас для вас совершить. О, верьтесь мне.
St. Petersburg, 1889. Pyotr Ilyich Tchaikovsky is at the height of his fame, loved by the public and the nobility alike. His music has become the benchmark of the new Russian style. But his journey to national treasure status has been far from easy. He's fled a disastrous marriage and travelled restlessly for years. Back in Russia, he's embraced by the establishment, but is unable to be open about his homosexuality. Yet he agrees reluctantly to write a new opera for the Imperial Theatre. Tchaikovsky gets to work, and just 44 days later, the new score is complete, one of his most varied and impressive. It's the Queen of Spades. Based on Alexander Pushkin's short story and drawing more than a little on the composer's own personal life, the opera combines a ghost story about obsession with operatic tragedy, a potent mix that inspires some of Tchaikovsky's most striking music. I'm Dr. Flora Willson, and I'm delighted to be presenting this insight this evening. We've just heard baritone Vladimir Stoyovsky and pianist Patrick Milne in Ya Vas Lublю, and we've got plenty more performance to come this evening. But to kick things off, and to talk to me about the man behind the music, please welcome Philip Bullock, Professor of Russian Literature and Music at Oxford University. Thanks for joining us, Philip.
Thank you.
Can you tell us a bit more about where the idea for this opera came from? Because it actually predates Tchaikovsky, doesn't it?
It does. In 1885, the director of the Imperial Theatres, Ivan Vsevolozhsky, came up with a plan of an opera based on Pushkin's Queen of Spades. It's a momentous year because that was the year the Italian opera was closed in Petersburg, and Vsevolozhsky was very keen to promote Russian repertoire. The problem was they couldn't quite find a composer or a librettist, and for a couple of years, quite a lot of names are kicked around between the creative teams in the theatres. Then, by September 1887, they have at last found a librettist, and the librettist is Modest Tchaikovsky, Pyotr Tchaikovsky's younger brother. And he is a playwright largely neglected these days, but very well known for producing Tchaikovsky librettos. And he agrees to write a version of the Queen of Spades, but he can't persuade his brother to write the music for it. So the music then gets passed to a composer we now think of very seldom, Nikolai Klinovsky, who promises to come up with a score full of the influence of Lakmé and Manon, a rather strange thought to think
So
what
French
that
opera.
French opera was really what was sort of driving that initial correspondence. And certainly there are, even in the opera we know, quite a lot of references to French and Italian opera as well as Russian repertoire. That collaboration, though, really doesn't get very far. Klinovsky sketches some music, and by the spring of 1889, the project has come to a standstill.
So the obvious question is, at what point did Tchaikovsky come on board?
It was the very end of 1889, and having been rather reluctant to go near the opera to start with, he'd just, when this opera was first thought about, seen the premiere of his previous opera, The Enchantress, and it wasn't a great success, and he was very dissatisfied with that work, and was coy about going back to opera so quickly. By 1889, he'd sort of put those reservations behind him and felt really ready for the task, and there was an important meeting in the Imperial Theatres where they agreed that Modeste's libretto would be given to Pyotr Ilyich to write. They made two very important other decisions. One was to add a scene for Liza in Act 3, because those who know the original short story by Pushkin will know that her fate is rather different. And they needed to know, Tchaikovsky felt the audience needed to know what happened to the operatic heroine. And they also decided to move the action back into the 18th century, to the era of Catherine the Great. Pushkin's story is set in the 1830s, and so this was a very significant move back in time.
Yeah. I mean, I said in my introduction that he wrote this in 44 days, which just sounds absolutely staggering. I mean, how did that work? And is this actually true?
It is true. Tchaikovsky had a prodigious work ethic throughout his life. He very much felt that inspiration only ever came to those who were prepared to put the effort in. And even when he wasn't inspired, he always got up and wrote and orchestrated and proofread his scores and parts. But in this case, this was total inspiration. He left Petersburg having just witnessed the premiere of Sleeping Beauty, which was a very significant event in Petersburg cultural life, and headed to Florence as if he couldn't write an opera about Petersburg in Petersburg, and went off to the sunnier climes of Italy. And he wrote very, very quickly, drafting the opera almost scene by scene. Scenes 3 and 4 are not composed in the right order, but otherwise he starts at the beginning and ends at the end.
And when we say composing, was he writing the whole thing at that point, or
he was writing very much in advanced draft form, sketched form, so that he has the libretto. He's also writing back to Modeste very regularly saying, I need some more words here because I've written some very good music and I need words that will go with it. Or actually, can you cut a lot of words? And one of the very striking things is how much Tchaikovsky cuts from the libretto to create this very terse, very dramatic opera. And he produces the opera in 44 days, pretty much clear in its total structure. All of the melodies, all of the shapes are there. And then he produces very quickly a piano score with all the parts in it because the singers need to learn it, and he turns that around incredibly quickly. So yes, draft is misleading. It is effectively complete in 44 days.
That's absolutely astounding. Thank you so much, Philip. We'll talk to you again a bit later.
Thank you.
Thank you. Now, to talk to me about what it's like to perform this opera, please welcome Vladimir Stoyanov and John Lundgren. Thank you so much. Thank you for joining us.
Hello, nice to meet you.
Thank you. Oh, thank you, Vladimir, for that wonderful, wonderful performance.
My pleasure.
So, just to get us going, can you each tell us a bit about your characters that you play in this opera, about them? Who are they?
Yes, Tomsky, I think he's upper class, kind of a macho guy. And he is a person who I feel from the text that people listen to, they ask him things, and they let him lead the temperature in the room a lot, I feel. About his character, who he is when he's alone, I don't know actually. That is, I can dream and I can fantasize, but it doesn't say so much about it in the text, what I know.
Okay, thank you. And I mean, what about you, Vladimir? Who are you?
I don't know. It was a joke. No, I actually I have two characters in this opera. The first is Prince Zelensky,
who is the character in Tchaikovsky's
the character, and the second is the composer, Tchaikovsky. And it's a very exciting story because this is the brilliant creature of our stage director, because the composer does not exist in the drama. Mm-hmm. But interpretation of Stefan is very sensitive, very smart, I would say, because Tchaikovsky is driving the whole drama. Mm-hmm. He's a kind of magician who creates all of the characters and driving the drama into one direction. Then he's changing the way of the drama. He's cancelling. He's composing on stage.
I mean, he's on stage.
Rich. Yeah,
almost
I'm on stage
all the time.
from the beginning till the end.
I mean, how do you prepare for that? How do you pace yourself?
It wasn't very easy, but I had my experience in the first production in Amsterdam, and then is the second one for me. But it's really very nice experience. It's very exhausting, because for us singers it's easier when we sing on stage and we can represent our characters. And in this case, I feel myself like Charlie Chaplin. You know, it's incredible. Without speaking, without words, you have to explain to the audience everything, which is extremely difficult.
And yet you came back for more. That's amazing. I mean,
yeah. But the positive thing that Tchaikovsky is the main character in this opera, in this interpretation, and I'm very happy about that.
I mean, I wonder whether you could say a little bit about the piece you sang at the start of this evening, actually, because, I mean, it really is, it's such a lyrical highlight in an opera full of lyric highlights. I mean, how does it actually feel to sing?
Yeah, it's one of the most beautiful arias for baritone from the Russian repertoire, obviously. And I love so much this aria. It's very lyric, it's very deeply sensitive, and represents the love of Prince Zelensky to Liza. Mm. It's a love declaration, absolutely endless. Very nice. The words are very beautiful. Yeah. Pushkin, of course.
Of course. Now, speaking of the words, I mean, John, this is not only your first Tomsky, it's actually your first role in Russian, I believe.
It is,
so
actually.
How are you finding those
Thank
words?
you very much. Welcome to the club.
So how are you finding singing in Russian? How different is it?
It's maybe, it sounds maybe as a bigger challenge than it is, because it's, if you sing in German or Italian or in Czech that I've done, or actually in your home language, Swedish, you cannot just take your dialect or personal voice and just go in and do it. Never. Absolutely not in opera. You need to combine it with the music and the style of it. And even if you are born in Germany, you need to learn the style of the language, and that is what I need too. Of course, when I learn it, I need to have a translation of every word, of course, and then made my own pictures for it, my own film, so you can say. And then, of course, good language coaches. We have a fantastic language coach, Arfenova, who is sitting every rehearsals. And it's very helpful, because we always, as an opera singer, you always need to be very humble for the language. You can never say, oh, I know this style now, I know that. Of course, when I sing in Wagner, after years now of Wagner singing, I feel that I know different styles, where the limits are and what the references is. I cannot know this in Russian. So I'm like a child with big eyes, and I also have colleagues that sometimes maybe say something if it's totally wrong. But they are also, or maybe they do that the day before the premiere, maybe they say, you are all wrong. But I don't know. Until now, I'm happy.
I mean, it's interesting. You mentioned that you sing in German, that you sing Wagner. I mean, you've been here singing Wotan quite recently in the Ring Cycle. I wonder, I mean, how different does Tchaikovsky write for the voice compared to Wagner? I mean, Tchaikovsky didn't like Wagner at all, we should say. We didn't like the music.
No. I like them both. So,
That's very diplomatic.
and as you heard when Vladimir sang this aria, you cannot do this without a good bel canto technique. Mm-hmm. It's impossible. You cannot sing Wagner without it either, but maybe some style of Wagner is more rough. It's okay that it sounds a little bit rough. I prefer to use my bel canto singing in every language. And if someone say, no, this is too beautiful, or this is too bel canto, okay, then you can choose to do it more character or whatever, more staccato. But it's always, if you are from Bulgaria or Armenia or Sweden or French or whatever, I think it's the good advice to just go out from the bel canto and then find a style. And the language, of course, it's different. And this music is so romantic, it's fantastic. I feel sometimes it's like singing Puccini or something. Yeah. It's really the big feelings and everything just pour out of you. So
I mean, if you had to characterize Tchaikovsky's writing, I mean, what's at the core of it, do you think?
So it was really difficult to find because nobody knew Tchaikovsky personally. So we only have information about the person, the life, biography. But generally, it's imagination helps us a lot. The interpretation of the ideas of the stage director, of the colleagues, of the music, of the text. But as a creature, the character is created from nothing. Mm-hmm. And like a dust, like an air, it's something very, very, how to say?
I mean, that's actually such a beautiful way of putting it. I mean, the idea of a character created from air or dust. I mean,
from nothing. It's a miracle because really, it's a person from nothing, from the air. It's incredibly difficult. Extremely difficult.
So I mean, sorry, John.
What I've thought one technical challenge in this is, and I've also heard it in the other arias for the other singers, and that is that the excitement you build up during an aria, it's also the tessitura is higher and higher. Mm-hmm. So it's not just a high note in the end, it's everything goes up in the excitement, and there you really need to have this bel canto technique, because if you just go for it, it will not be any high notes in the end. So and that is a challenge. And then I heard a soprano aria, one of them, and I heard, oh, this is written in the same way. And of course it works for the audience fantastically, because the singer is going more and more, but you need to stay down, calm.
The technique, the fundament.
That is very important.
It's very important for every composer, for every type of repertoire.
Yeah.
No, that's fascinating. Thank you. I mean, Vladimir, you as you said, sang this for Dutch National Opera for the co-production there a couple of years ago. I mean, what was that like singing in Amsterdam?
Yeah, it was very nice experience there. It was another theater, another kind of audience, another temperament, everything is different. I hope to find another audience here.
Well, I was going to say,
better or less, I don't care. But the passion, I want to see the passion in the eyes of the audience. This is very important for us. The support of the audience.
Oh, well, I hope you will find that. I mean, how have you both been finding working with Tony Pappano on this?
This is the first time for me, and I'm very curious and very, very excited because it's a nice person, a good musician, very nice musician. He's studying with us every day during the rehearsals, staging rehearsals, which is not very. It's not normal thing. I think usually the directors conductors are coming in the last week or last 10 days. Tony's presented from the first day. Yeah, and this is very positive for us. Very good, good work together.
And we develop it very much together with him.
Yeah.
Not like we fulfill his rules of doing this. It's very much that we, from time to time, discuss and he asks, and we do it in another way. And he has no law book over how he wants to do this. He also invents. And together, also with Stefan Herheim.
We create it together, create together.
Yeah, so it really is a collaboration. Yeah. That's fascinating. I mean, I must ask, do you have favourite moments in this opera? Whether you sing them or not? Am I allowed to ask?
The whole opera for me.
Yeah, because you're on stage all the time. I think my little naughty aria in the end, it's kind of... It's kind of simple, actually, but I like it because it's so... it's not typical for my repertoire and my career at all to sing this. So this is a gift to do. It's not challenging in that way that the tessitura goes up in the end. It's more of playful, and it's in the end of the part, and it's in the end of Tomsky's part. So it's really, yeah. It's not ending with a big aria, it's ending with a simple little song, actually.
Fantastic.
Very naughty. Yeah.
Thank you. That's something for us all to listen out for. And thank you both for joining us this evening. It's a real pleasure to have you here. Good luck for the first night.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, the chorus in The Queen of Spades plays a vital role, driving the story forward and exposing the psychological struggles of the opera's leading characters. To tell us more, please welcome the Royal Opera House chorus master, William Spaulding. Hi, William. Thank you so much for joining us. So in just a moment, we're going to see you actually working with the chorus. I wonder, could you tell us a little bit first about how Tchaikovsky uses them in this opera?
Sure. You mentioned the psychological aspects, the conflicts, the situations that the soloists find themselves in. And it turns out that the specific nature of all these conflicts is so intense and always fraught with darkness that it just turns out that the chorus ends up fulfilling the role of comic relief. So you can't show endless struggling, endless pain over unlucky loves and whatever for too long. You know, we know that from Hamlet, Gravedigger scene and all that, you know, it's a classic theater concept, comic relief.
Absolutely. So it's all light and dark. Just to ask you, you're going to just work with a small number of choristers this evening, but how many are there in this production as a whole?
We have 61 wonderful singers on stage, yes.
Goodness, so that is a large chorus.
Well, you can do it with, some theaters do it with more, but I have to say with 61 singers such as these wonderful people that I work with every day, it sounds great.
It does indeed sound brilliant. Thank you very much, William. I'll let you get started.
Great.
So please welcome members of the Royal Opera Chorus, led by chorus director William Spaulding and accompanied by assistant chorus master Genevieve Ellis.
Yes, we mentioned the chorus's function as comic relief, and but we won't get too far in the Queen of Spades talking about it, thinking about it, trying to understand it, without mentioning the name Mozart. Seems trite to say, but Tchaikovsky loved Mozart. Of course, we all love Mozart, more or less. But Mozart was a deep inspiration to Tchaikovsky. Even there, that's no big exception. But it really goes so far as to cause certain references to be made in our staging. So our staging makes references, visible references to Tchaikovsky's inner relationship to Mozart. And these references turned out to be very well founded indeed. Наступит скоро час, любовь спрягает нас, любовь спрягает Ty nas любовь спрягает. Lovely, thank you for that lovely crescendo on the word любовь, love. Now, even if the Queen of Spades is new to you, you might have a vague sense of familiarity regarding what you just heard. And that could be due to this. Genevieve, Ellis, if you please. Or in Papageno's original key. Yes, and the staging has some nice surprises in store for us regarding the Mozart connection. Now, going back to the idea of comic relief, it turns out that we really need it. I mean, everybody's unhappy in his opera. Hermann is unlucky in love, unlucky in fortune. The prince is engaged to a girl that doesn't love him. The old countess lives in constant fear that someone will demand the secret of her 3 cards. And Liza ends up taking her own life in despair. And as we saw earlier, you just can't, perception just won't allow such darkness, you know, without any kind of interruption. And such is the nature of the chorus, particularly in this next number where they sing of the simple joy of a walk in the park. Great job. Bit of an abrupt ending there, but at that moment the soloists take up their sad stories again. Now, in the middle section of this, what you just heard, the chorus kind of breaks up into 4 different groups, and they each have a little story of their own to tell, and they represent 4 distinct characters. For instance, the basses. Been a long time since we've seen such days. In the reign of Elizabeth, we saw days like that much more often. 1, 2, And the mezzos. We lived better in the old days. Times are worse now. And the tenors sing of the fresh air, the blue sky, but also, wouldn't you know it, of the bright color on the cheeks of young ladies. Yes, indeed. You can hear it has a completely different kind of energy. The rhythm, than the more different kind of character that the lower voices are responsible for. And the sopranos, to the sopranos are given the quintessence of our part, really. They sing nothing less than Kakadratna Jit, how wonderful it is to live, precisely the thing that the soloists have so much trouble realizing. Yeah. Very nice. We put all that together and sing the rest of it then to the end. A good idea of it? No, yeah. Otherwise, good. Applause for the second time. Yes. Now, getting back to the Mozart references, the absolute high point, the apex of this connection is the beginning of Act 2. Thank you for that. Now, you can hear the Mozart connection there. It's very obvious. When artists imitate the style of others, as Prokofiev did in the Classical Symphony, as Mozart himself imitated Bach with the chorale prelude in the Magic Flute, or as here with Tchaikovsky. The thing about that is, we as listeners are only going to like it, we're only going to accept it, really. We're only going to respond if the composer remains ultimately on a deeper level true to him or herself. And indeed, if this were Mozart, it's a hypothetical, the singers would perhaps sing it differently. They might approach it something like this. Mozart. It's Tchaikovsky. The phrases are sostenuto, the final two notes are full of sound, and all is as red-blooded and Russian as anything gets. And I'd like on this, at this juncture to pay special thanks and admiration for these 8 singers, because the Tchaikovskyan, sound of power of sound, they're doing a great job of doing here. But in the end, we're 61 singers that do that. So just try and keep that in mind. So. Ladies and gents, I'm going to ask you to skip now to figure 6 of this number. Yeah, I mean, just hearing that last version of it, it's really as though Tchaikovsky were to try on one of those powdered wigs and yet still be recognizable to his friends. So we're going from figure 6. Yeah, here we go. Now, ladies and gents, this last section, Chazyain, it needs a little bit of something else. We've heard several times, and again, and then a repetition of the whole thing once more. It's starting to get, the audience is starting to wonder, hey, Peter Ilyich, you running out of ideas here, or what's going on? It's almost like you want to sing this as though everything before it were just a lazy excuse to dig into the glory of this. So right on it, please, ladies and gents. And 1, 2. It continues, right? Me too, actually. So we'll sing the entire movement from the beginning, please.
Thank you so much. Well, if that's what 8 chorus members sound like, I can't wait to hear the whole ensemble. Pushkin, Dostoevsky and Rimsky-Korsakov were just a few of the other eminent Russian artists working in St. Petersburg during the 19th century. To talk to me more about how the city's special cultural climate allowed these iconic figures to flourish, please welcome back Professor Philip Bullock. Hi, Philip. This opera and Pushkin's short story are both set in St. Petersburg, which was a city where Tchaikovsky had actually studied, I think, in the 1850s and 60s. What sort of depictions of the city would he have been familiar with by the time he was writing this in 1890?
I think that question goes to the heart of what makes this opera so fascinating. Pushkin's Queen of Spades is a text from 1834, so the early 19th century, but it really initiates what we in the trade think of as the Petersburg text. And this is where the city of Petersburg stops being a background and becomes a character in its own right. And this is followed through in texts like Pushkin's Bronze Horseman, tales by Nikolai Gogol, and most famously, Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, a story about a young, impecunious man who does away with an old woman and who has a complicated relationship with a virginal, innocent young woman. Sounds slightly familiar.
It doesn't sound entirely far apart from this.
So that's really one of the things that's going on in the 1890s, is that Tchaikovsky is able to look back and layer all of these associations together. And as we just heard there, also add in all these references to the 18th century in Petersburg, which is a very different kind of city from the Dostoevskian, brooding, dark, melodramatic city that we perhaps hear associated with Herman and Liza.
Absolutely. So how does he actually sort of represent the city in this opera?
Well, he layers the city musically in various ways. So we hear the very modern music associated particularly with Liza and with Herman, but we also hear this stylization of the 18th century, of the masks, the balls, the dances and the opera of the 18th century, of the era of Catherine the Great. And he doesn't try and iron out the differences. He allows us to move from one world, from the 18th century through the 1830s to the 1890s, and even forwards into our own day, by holding them together in a quite occasionally dissonant way. And I think that was one of the most remarkable things about the opera. It was a really forward-looking piece of work. Remember, Mahler conducted it in Hamburg and then in New York in 1910. And all of those clashing musical worlds that you get in Mahler, I think probably he may have heard them in Tchaikovsky and the Queen of Spades.
Yeah, that's fascinating. This idea of the opera as a sort of time machine, almost, of different music from different times.
Yes, and one of the best moments for me is when the Countess in Act 2 is sitting in her boudoir and she sings an aria from an opera by Grétry, Richard Coeur de Lion, which was written and performed in 1784.
It was incredibly popular in 19th century Paris, particularly.
But this is an opera that, at this moment, she's singing an aria which recalls her youth. But this is an opera set in the 18th century. So there's all of this, and I don't think it's an accident. These anachronisms and this time travelling was a very decidedly modern feature of this opera. So to layer together the 18th neoclassical French side. And I suppose the other thing that Tchaikovsky is also doing is not referring just to 18th century music, but to the popularity of French and Italian music in Petersburg throughout the 19th century. It had been there all the way through the 18th century. And then in the time of Nicholas I, he had established an Italian opera troupe in the city, and Russian opera often had a hard time getting a hearing. But in 1859, the Mariinsky Theatre is founded, and that's where Russian operas are increasingly heard. And eventually, in 1885, the Italian opera is disbanded, and Russian opera can really take control of the musical scene. And I think Tchaikovsky is playing with that sense of Petersburg as a city which holds together the Russian seat of power, Russian government, Russian high society, and yet Francophilia, a love of Italian opera. And that layering of languages, of musical styles, is very like the layering of temporal references and the time travel that goes on in the music as well.
That's fascinating. I mean, what was the artistic legacy of this opera then, in St. Petersburg or further afield in Russia?
Well, it was performed very regularly afterwards. It was performed in Moscow, Kiev, Saratov, Odessa. As I said, Mahler conducted it in Hamburg and then in New York. In Petersburg, it triggers a very enthusiastic reaction, like The Sleeping Beauty, on the part of a group of very young artists. And these artists are very well known to us in another guise. This is Sergei Diaghilev, Alexander Benoit, and Leon Bax, the artists who will form the Ballet Russe. And so all of that luxurious early 20th century ballet and opera that we associate with Paris really had its roots in The Sleeping Beauty and in particular The Queen of Spades, the anachronisms, the self-conscious, self-aware modernity of the work. Listening to it again the other day and comparing it to Onegin, I was struck by how intensely personal and lyric Onegin is, but also at times how abstracted The Queen of Spades can be, that Tchaikovsky is sometimes slightly playing with the characters. They're little puppets for him to play with. It's not to downplay the emotional intensity of the work, but I think there is that sort of stylized modernity about it. And I even wonder whether it might look forward to, strange as it seems, a work like Berg's Wozzeck, a work in which a hero and a heroine are manipulated by cruel fate, by social forces. And so this work from 1890, Tchaikovsky dies just 3 years later, and very young age of 53, what role would he have played in the Ballet Russe? What role would he have played on the opera stages of Europe? Had he been able to follow on? We only have one more opera, Iolanta, less heard than it should be. So if anyone is listening in the ballet department at Covent Garden, it would be nice to have that in future. But I think I'd love to see Queen of Spades really as a look back to the past, but also as a door to a future that Tchaikovsky himself, alas, would never quite inhabit.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much, Philip. We'll come back to you later. Thank you. Well, our next musical performance is another of the opera's unforgettably expressive highlights. Singing Už polnoc blízится, It Will Soon Be Midnight, from Act 3. Please welcome Lee Bissett and Patrick Milne. Thank you, Lee and Patrick. That aria gets me every time. It really is the emotional sort of heart of the piece, isn't it?
Indeed.
So Tchaikovsky's life, both his tortured private life and his public acclaim, they've really fascinated audiences and biographers alike, and you are one of Tchaikovsky's biographers. Could you tell us a bit more about the sort of autobiographical resonances of this piece in particular?
Yes, I think there are, and I like the word resonances rather than references. There are certain parallels one might see. Certainly Tchaikovsky felt very intimately drawn to the work and became very associated with the character of Hermann in his own mind. He wrote in his letters home that as he composed Hermann's final scene, he wept over the score. And that intense emotional involvement with the fate of a particular character was very characteristic of all of his operatic output. He would often identify intensely with a character. He does it with Tatiana, and in Yegin, she becomes the focus of that opera, largely, I think, because of how he grows to feel about her. There's another potential resonance. Tchaikovsky in 1877 married. Marriage didn't work out. He abandoned his job teaching at the Moscow Conservatory. And in order to make ends meet, he acquired a patron, Nadezhda von Meck. They never met, but they did exchange thousands of extremely intense and very detailed letters. By 1890, this relationship was becoming a little worn. It was less intimate in many ways, and he was occasionally expressing himself with a degree of tartness about her. And he'd also begun to get wind of the fact that she was probably in some financial trouble. In October 1890, she writes to cancel the subvention that she has given him for 13 years, which has given him the freedom to compose, to travel, not to teach, but to be a creative artist, a free artist. And some people have seen the depiction of the Countess as a sort of psychological portrait of Tchaikovsky's very complicated figures, a mysterious woman who holds the power over an impecunious individual to whom he's somehow indebted, but who he also wants to kill. I think that might be going too far, but it has been argued. The dates don't work. He'd finished the opera long before she broke off their relationship, but it's interesting that he never wrote to her during the composition of the opera. His last letter is before he leaves for Florence, and the next one is when he's finished the opera. So it's a strange absence of a relationship. So there are some resonances, yeah.
That's amazing. Philip, thank you so much. It's been fantastic to talk to you this evening.
Thank you
for joining us. Well, in this production, Stefan Herheim has taken the autobiographical nature of this opera and run with it. To tell us more about his army of Tchaikovskys and the creative vision for this production, please welcome Stefan Herheim and his designer, Philipp Fürhofer. Stefan, thank you so much.
Hello.
Hi, Philip. Well, thank you both for joining me. Stefan, we've been talking about the autobiographical nature of the opera and how it seems to mirror Tchaikovsky's life in certain ways, at least. This is a major theme in your production, isn't it? Could you tell us a bit more about how that works?
No, I can't, actually, because opera is all about not speaking. It's about singing, and then things get quite obvious. And talking about it always destroys, actually, the core of what you're trying to achieve. But of course, this is a practice in communicating opera, what we are doing now for 4 weeks. We have done it since 9 o'clock this morning, so we are kind of tired, but it's lovely to be here, and I'll tell you a little bit about our approach in general. It's been very interesting listening to what's been said by now. And our decision was simply, after a while, trying to figure out how this piece is constructed, to actually just leave Pushkin out and tell this is not possible. Since the piece was written, people have tried, especially also in Russia, to reconstruct things as they were planned in the short story by Pushkin, and try to rescue the opera from its own pathos and its own falseness and the untrue way of psychology. Because the main character, Hermann, he simply doesn't work anymore in this context. He's not a cynical guy who's abusing a little girl working for the princess. Now suddenly Lisa is standing really high in society. She's the granddaughter of the old Grafinia. And Hermann has no chance whatsoever to reach her. And his love to her is absolute, or it seems to be absolute. And the next moment he's totally confused and going for the original story again as a slave of the idea fix of the 3 cards, which he has to gain and win to have money to buy these ladies some kind of free, which also doesn't make sense because there would then be no space for them in this society at all, right? So we decided just to leave Pushkin out and go into the core of that score and to contradict our lovely Yeletsky I think by listening to the music of a composer, you actually get known to him. You don't necessarily, of course we read biographies and we try to travel in time and go back to the time it was written, but only by listening to it you really get into a personality like this. And I think it's one crucial truth about Tchaikovsky's biography and life and art, not at least, that he was a miserable human being who most probably killed himself. I mean, we know after having tried marriage with Antonina Milyova, he jumped into, after 2 days he escaped and he was disgusted by this woman. He wouldn't touch her at all and he never saw her again after these 2 days, throwing himself in the Volga, frozen Volga, getting inflammation. He was sick for it. People thought he was going to die actually. And then he had a total nerve breakdown, a total psychological breakdown. And it's very interesting to read his letters. Modest, his brother, who wrote this libretto, who convinced him after a long time, it took a long time for Modest to convince him to actually do this piece. And Yeletsky's role is actually a total, it doesn't exist at all in Pushkin's novel or short story. So this is a creation, and there's so incredibly many moments. It was said already, but I can only try to point it out, and this is exactly what we are trying with this production. There are so many parallels and analogic moments in the biography of Tchaikovsky and this piece, so you feel like, okay, he's actually abusing or using a famous story, but we actually just see the shadows of it, and we are thrown into a story which we don't understand from the very beginning. We have all the characters in the first act thrown together for the very first time. We have no idea who they are. 5 people standing alone, singing almost solo without orchestra in a very, very strange harmonic structure, how afraid they are of each other, of death, of their fear are projected in a way where you can only say opera is totally maniac, it's crazy, it is totally beyond any linear way of telling a story. So we concentrated totally on Tchaikovsky and created a room in which he is trying to compensate for the fact that his sexuality, his love, is unspeakable in this time. Yeah? 95, Oscar Wilde, as we know, was condemned in this very city for the same reasons of which Tchaikovsky was a miserable character, probably killing himself and using a whole life, running and escaping in music
Well, it's fascinating to hear you talk about this. I must say, having said you couldn't talk about this music, you're doing a fantastic job. So thank you for bearing with us. Could you say a little bit more about why Yeletsky and Tchaikovsky have become somehow merged in this production?
Well, actually, we have only 2 characters who are real in this story we are telling, which is a prostitute in the very beginning and Tchaikovsky himself. We don't really know exactly. It's a very big mystery about the death of Tchaikovsky. It's said that he drank this infected water, this cholera water, of which that's the official death reason of his. His mother also died of cholera when he was 14, opening a huge lack and loss for Tchaikovsky, which followed him his whole life. He can also have gotten this illness, whatever illness it actually was, because he was on Lit de Parade, he was placed open, which never happened with people dying of cholera. So that's a mystery in itself, making it a bit, it's very strange. That's very mysterious, the whole death of Tchaikovsky. It could also be that he drank this water actually at Modest's own apartment. We don't know if he took it to himself or he got actually an illness by these prostitutes. He was actually also, but he was in an immense terror. It's very much about guilt. The whole thing is really about guilt, and he's trying to get away from that. I'm not sure what your question was.
No, that's okay. It's fascinating. And oddly enough, the way you describe Tchaikovsky makes him sound like an operatic character in his own right, which is fascinating. Philip, I must ask you, what is it like to work with this man? You are regular collaborators. How does this work?
Well, you just got a good impression. No, joking.
I'm thinking quicker than I can talk English. That's my problem.
Yes, as you see, Stefan has a lot of ideas, and this is a really inspiring thing about it. It's but generally, it's not that quick that as it seems to be. It is more or less 2 or 3 years of really intense collaboration, listening to the music 500 times and really trying to get a solution for this piece, which is very tricky. I think you got an impression about what are the very illogical things about that. If you read the score or the libretto, you think, yeah, okay, it's based in Rococo, and but the point and the problematic thing is it doesn't sound like Rococo, as we heard. And in a normal traditional staging, it would have been placed in the 18th century, and that's it. And we thought it's one of the many reasons why it's linked to Tchaikovsky and the 18th, 19th century Tchaikovsky. But this, to speak that out, so to say, to have that kind of analyze it, it takes a long time, and that's why we have to listen and read and meet a lot and try to find our own version.
Yes,
Tchaikovsky characterized his own century as a century full of illness, apathetic, totally alienized time he was living in, and he was projecting himself highly on Mozart, thinking him as a god, living in an erotic time of age where people had no problem at all. That's why Mozart is how it is. It's just pure, and it's full of redemption and liberty, which is also an idea fix he's following in this piece, of course.
I love the way the obsession is still there from the short story. I wonder, we've actually got some images of the production. I wonder whether you could tell us about the different worlds it's moving in. Perhaps we could go to one of the actual photos. Might be nice, since we have the costumes, which we can talk about in a moment. I mean, tell us about this gang of Tchaikovskys. I mean, what are they wearing? We're in the same setting throughout the opera, aren't we, in this production? Where are we?
We are in a room which could have been Nadezhda von Meck's house, the richest widow in Russia at that time. She was married to the director of the railway company in Russia. He died. She inherited a lot of money, and she adored Tchaikovsky above everything. They wrote 1,200 letters with each other, but it was on one condition that this relation was going on. Tchaikovsky demanded that they would never, ever meet personally. But he lived in her houses, and he wrote a lot of his music in her houses as a guest. The servants have to be kept away, and he was like totally isolated in this huge castle she owned. And we place him, so to say, there. So we don't put this actually into the historical biographical truth of his he was running away to Italy and wrote this piece in 6 weeks. We are actually seeing this as a moment of death, actually. So the whole piece becomes a requiem. It becomes kind of a review where he reflects upon his whole misery and life situation. So as I said, we have only two characters on stage. The one is a prostitute who then turns into the idea of Hermann. And the other is obviously Tchaikovsky himself. And all these characters comes out of his head, out of his music, out of his fear, his projection.
Yeah. So we start with a realistic setting of this 19th century salon, which then opens up, the walls can light through so that it's getting this kind of black and white schema.
Translucent.
And translucence and irreality. So it's always merging or layering, as we heard before.
We can see the opulence of this setting, these vast chandeliers. I mean, it really is an incredibly rich setting.
It starts in a very basically small room that can open up massively,
and change in many ways. So it's like a labyrinth of the psychic situation of Tchaikovsky himself.
Yeah, and then what about the costumes? I mean, we're sitting here. It's fantastic to have these costumes. Philip, could you talk us through them a little bit, perhaps? I mean, could you tell us what we're looking at here?
So basically, I mean, what we were starting off, and what you could also see from the photos, we are starting with this, which is Tchaikovsky himself, and we took that from a historical photo of himself from his last years, where he used to wear this maybe very uncomfortable tweed, very tied up suits, and this kind of jacket is then merging into all the other characters, even the women. So we have the two basis of women costumes here in black and white. The black and white comes, of course, of this what we call salt and pepper tweed. And even if it's getting into a Rococo version, it's kind of a broken or twisted Rococo. You would never use this kind of wool.
This is the 18th century, the sort of the big old-fashioned bustles as they would have been.
Exactly, but it's twisted, and as we learned before, it's not a real Rococo, it's a Rococo seen through Tchaikovsky. And therefore, this is a kind of a woolness which you would never use in a period Rococo version. You have this basically the whole costume is done with 3 different materials, which is wool, then a kind of dupion, silk, and what you have here, this kind of red
The velvet.
velvet, yeah. And this goes all through all the whole show with all the characters.
Sense, all these characters have indeed come from Tchaikovsky's outfits,
yes.
even.
Yes, exactly. And there's this another, well, trick which was based practically in a cost reason, was that normally you could easily use something like 300 costumes in an opera like this, depending on the size of the chorus. There was a, well, financial challenge in a way, which led us to a simple trick for the ladies of the chorus that are switching between 19th century, what you can see here.
Oh, so that classic late 19th century gathering.
With the bustle in the back, to the 18th century pannier version, is that we have the same overdress, which can be folded back to this version with a different underdress. And you should imagine that the whole chorus is running out, especially in Act 1, several times off stage, on stage, changing all the time, constantly between that. So we have a kind of an armada of something like 50 dressers backstage, helping the chorus members in 2 or 3, sometimes 4 minutes to totally change.
How amazing.
Also with wigs.
I love the idea that the women of the chorus actually have some kind of capsule wardrobe here. It's fantastic.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for showing us those, Philip. What would you like us to take from this production, Stefan?
Oh dear. Life's hard. Life's really hard. And this goes far deeper than we would actually mostly like to admit as opera goers. We want to be entertained, and this is not art to be consumed easily. This goes really under the skin, and this tells us also at the very end something, of course, about society and who we are and our ideas of reality. And we adore a composer like Tchaikovsky and his music, but still in his own country, Russia, homosexuality is punished by law, you know, and prosecuted. And what this does to us as human beings, how that transforms us, and how art can learn us actually to change and to start actually to listen to our deeper needs when it comes to communication and trust and hope, love, and everything that actually gives us an opportunity to unite us in the way operatic art does, as a community, sitting and sharing something, becoming a very spiritual experience of being a part of humanity. That's, I guess, my highest ideal about doing this, and to become one actually with your own time and people around you through music and through listening, learning to listen actually deeper than we are used to and forced to in our reality.
So this is a Queen of Spades for the 21st century, in other words?
I think all operas are, and we have to associate and we have to identify with this music, otherwise it doesn't make sense to try to make it come alive. We have to give ourselves totally to it, and by that it automatically becomes something which is here and now, which is important and relevant.
Thank you both so much, Stefan and Philip. It's been fantastic to have you here. Thank you for letting us see a sneak preview of your production. That's really wonderful. Well, sadly, that's all we've got time for this evening. We've had people watching all over the world, including in South Korea, in Brazil, Colombia, and Poland. So this truly is opera with a global reach. So please, I'd love you all to join me in thanking all our guests this evening, including, of course, Stefan and Philip. And if this evening has whet your appetite, you can catch the Queen of Spades in a cinema near you on the 22nd of January. That'll be all over the world, or live on stage from the 13th of January. Good night, and we wish you a very good Christmas.